Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for being with us this afternoon. This is our 8th event of this sustainability lecture and dialogue series. We started this program last semester to feature UNCG researchers who are doing a really important work to address aspects of sustainability and to have dialogues around those issues. So if you missed the past events, most of them are available on the Office of Sustainability website. So please do check them out. Today, it's my pleasure to introduce two wonderful speakers on the topic of animal ethics. Sena Crutchley is a speech language pathology professor by day and a social justice and environmental activist 24/7. Professor Crutchley is an active member of UNCG's Sustainability Council. And in the community, she's the president of Piedmont Area Vegan Educators, or PAVE. This is a local grassroots vegan advocacy group. Sena also has a microsanctuary for chickens called Ruby's Refuge. And she's a volunteer mentor for new vegans through the Peace Advocacy Network. Her talk today is entitled Harming Animals and the Environment. Dr. Gwen Hunnicutt is an associate professor of sociology, and she's also cross-appointed faculty in the Women's and Gender Studies program. She is a former UNCG Sustainability Faculty Fellow, and she will serve again in this capacity next year. So we're very excited about that. Her research is located at the intersections of violence studies, green criminology, feminist criminology, gender, peace, and security studies, and ecofeminism. She has a recent book, Gender Violence in Ecofeminist Perspective, Intersections of Animal Oppression, Patriarchy, and Domination of the Earth, that came out last year. This calls for an eco-centered, eco-feminist, informed discussion about the ways in which gender, patriarchy, and violence are all bound up with our relationship to the environment. The book is available at the UNCG library as an ebook, so please check it out. Today, she will talk about trans-species harm and the multiplicity of violence from climate change. So please join me in welcoming both speakers.
Thank you, Etsuko. Okay, so I guess I'm going to start. And thank you so much for everyone coming today. And I really appreciate getting to present with Gwen. But I'm going to share just a little bit more about me and how I got involved in this topic. I grew up eating animals and wearing animals, you know, like with animal skin leather. I went vegetarian in high school. And then I went vegan in 2012 after visiting a local dairy farm. And I've also always cared about the environment. And as a speech pathologist, it's important for me to speak up for people who are not heard. So humans and non-human animals. But before we start, let me see if I can pull up my slides. Okay, so this is my topic, a little play on language with farming. So harming, farming animals and the environment. And I want to introduce you to Ruby first. So Ruby is really who got me on my journey toward veganism and learning about animal agriculture. So I just wanted to introduce you, and then we'll talk a little bit more about her later. And maybe some of you are feeling kind of like how Ruby was this one day about a year ago, walking down our hallway, just a little bit apprehensive about this information. This may be fear of the unknown. And many of you may be thinking I'm going to talk about what we think of in terms of animal agriculture, thinking more in terms of factory farming. Many of us in North Carolina are familiar with the problems related to hog waste and those manure lagoons that we see at the North Carolina coast. And those concerns are absolutely valid. But if we only focus on those industrialized practices, it creates this false sense that we are not complicit in harm when we consume animals who we believe were raised or killed through better systems. So what I hope you come away with today, not feeling like this, what I hope you come away with today is understanding that an entirely plant-based food system will always be more sustainable and more just than even the most local, humane, smallest, family-owned, grass-fed, organic, free-range, chocolate on the pillow, tucked in bed at night animal agriculture. So let me see if I can get this shared again. Okay. According to the Alliance of World Scientists, the #1 thing that individuals can do for the environment is avoid all animal products. So if this information is readily available, and it is, even though it's not something that we hear about regularly, why are people still consuming animals and their secretions like eggs and milk? Well, there are several reasons, but today I'm going to address some of the biggest myths that allow animal agriculture to persist. So the first myth is that there is a way to make animal farming sustainable. A lot of money, time, and effort is going into trying to make animal agriculture at least appear sustainable. And then another myth is that regenerative agriculture, you may have heard of it, it's this new hot topic, that regenerative agriculture is a solution to concerns about our carbon footprint and soil health. And then another myth is that it's okay to eat some kinds of animals or their eggs and milk as long as one avoids eating cows. So let's start with the myth of sustainability, and we'll look at some of the most palpable problems with animal agriculture. So greenhouse gas emissions in this study, So greenhouse gas emissions, the reports range for animal agriculture from between about 14% to about 51%. And it varies because it depends on how the organization is measuring those greenhouse gas emissions. But when you look at the totality of animal agriculture, which would include not just the methane directly produced from cows, when you look at running slaughterhouses, transporting animals to slaughterhouses, then the body parts from, so all those processes produce greenhouse gases. And so really now some of the reports are coming out to be even higher than 51%. And you see that vegans are responsible for far fewer greenhouse gas emissions than non-vegans, and let's look at why. So this study, this infographic of a study that was completed on greenhouse gas emissions in Germany takes a look at greenhouse gas emissions according to diet type. So an omnivorous diet compared to a vegetarian diet and then compared to a vegan diet. The dark green band is a conventional diet. And then the light green band is an organic diet. So if you have someone who is an omnivore and they decide that, with good intentions that they're going to switch to all organic, they really just make a dent in their carbon footprint. And then maybe you'll have someone who's a vegetarian. Again, that's a little bit better. But looking at vegans, this is why there are so far fewer greenhouse gas emissions. A vegan who consumes all conventional foods and no organic foods will still be producing far fewer greenhouse gas emissions than a vegetarian or an omnivore who eats all organic. And then even further looking at that study, I thought this was really interesting. If someone wants to just cut out cheese, and then that would mean essentially becoming vegan unless they have eggs. But cheese makes such a difference in greenhouse gas emissions. The greenhouse gas emissions from cheese is actually higher than that of cow flesh. And then if someone well-meaning just decides that they will cut out eating cows and bulls, thereby eliminating beef, then you'll see they're just making a little dent in the greenhouse gas emissions. Really, the best way to cut our carbon footprint is by going vegan. So let's look at some other facts related to animal agriculture that often get ignored because we often focus on carbon footprint. Land use is far more extensive with animal agriculture, as you can see. And this is because so much land is used to grow feed for the animals, and then the animals take up space, take up land. And then the leading cause of biodiversity loss is the loss of wild areas to agriculture, and that's mostly through animal agriculture. And it takes about 10 times more fossil fuels to produce 1 calorie of animal protein compared to 1 calorie of plant protein. And that's because there are so many extra steps in the animal agriculture process that just doesn't happen in plant agriculture, like the slaughterhouse running and the transportation and that I mentioned a moment ago. Okay, so looking now at other resources, water use. Water is huge, and I really appreciate having access to fresh water. I've lived in places where we've had drought. We've had droughts in Greensboro. About half of our fresh water in the United States is used by animal agriculture. So I'm going to say that again so that it sinks in. Half of our fresh water in the United States is used by animal agriculture. About 1/3 of the global fresh water is used by animal agriculture. So imagine if we could free up all of that fresh water, how wonderful that would be. And then another issue is something known as pre-consumer food loss, and that's how much food is wasted in the production process. And so you can see that far more food product goes into raising an animal for food, so animal feed, than what is yielded. And that just doesn't happen with plant agriculture. There really isn't any food loss. If our planet was all on a plant-based food system, and I know that's not happening today, but if it were, then we could feed 4 billion more people. So continuing to talk about the myths, they're related to what's known as greenwashing and humane washing. Many of you have probably heard of greenwashing, and it basically relates to marketing strategies that companies will use to deceive customers into thinking that their product or service is environmentally friendly when they really aren't. And then humane washing is basically the same concept. Companies will use terms in their marketing to trick an unsuspecting consumer into thinking that their product is kind to animals when it's simply not true. So we'll talk about greenwashing first. So here are some terms that many of you are probably familiar with, so you can scan down that list. But looking at the bottom of the list, local, we hear eat local, right? That's very popular. But we often don't question some of these terms. And this is very popular with locavores, eat local. But in reality, the transportation part of food systems only uses about 11%, only produces about 11% of the emissions, but the production phase causes about 83% of the emissions. And the production phase is so heavy with animal agriculture. So it's not how far the food has traveled, it's the type of food. Poor and Nemechek reported in their 2018 study of over 38,000 farms across 119 countries that even the highest impact vegetable, so this is quote, even the highest impact vegetable, like tofu, for example, still emits less than the lowest impact animal protein. A kilo of soy shipped halfway around the world inflicts much less atmospheric harm than a kilo of chicken or pork or beef reared on the local farm. So, and then despite all of these terms that you see, these greenwashing terms, Poor and Nemechek state that, again, this is quote, the lowest impact meat and dairy are more environmentally damaging than the least sustainable plant agriculture with grains and vegetables. And then Poor, who became vegan as a result of completing this study, reported a vegan diet is probably the single biggest way to reduce your impact on planet Earth, not just with greenhouse gases, but global acidification, eutrophication, land use, and water use. It's far bigger than cutting down on your flights or buying an electric car. That's compelling, huh? Okay, so let's look at humane washing, and you'll notice some overlap with the terms, and that suggests that we would think that someone who cares about the environment also cares about animals. And honestly, I need to share with you that there was a time when I believed these terms and I was willing to pay a lot more money for products that had some of these labels like pasture raised and cage free or certified humane. And so, okay, sorry, looking at organic, this is really the only one of these terms that's carefully regulated. To be organic, an animal raised has to be raised drug-free, so there can't be any medications, even if an animal is sick and needs medications. To be labeled organic, they can't get those medications. And the feed has to be organic. With some species, they may need access to the outside. And then speaking of regulation, I think we probably all know there's been widespread deregulation, and often there are no inspections. So farmers can really put anything on a label except organic and expect no negative consequences. So let's look at some more terms. So free range just really means that there has to be access to the outside, but it's not specified. And there's that word local again. So these humane washing terms support the humane myth, or it's also known as the humane hoax. And it's the notion that you can humanely objectify, commodify, consume, and destroy the body of a non-consenting being, and that it's okay if you're nice about it. That's the humane hoax or the humane myth. Okay, so now let's address that myth about that it's okay to eat some animals. So this is where I said earlier that some feel like as long as you don't eat cows, that this is okay. So the myth that it's sustainable and environmentally friendly to eat some animals. So we're going to talk about chickens first, and this would apply also to turkeys and quails, but we're going to focus on chickens. We often see humane washing terms when it comes to birds and their eggs. We'll see cage-free and free range. And they often come with these bucolic images, and we learn to associate those terms then with these kinds of settings. But more often than not, these settings are not the reality. And even if they are, they're still places where thinking and feeling sentient beings are objectified and commodified. And then this reflects another myth. It's the myth of implied consent. That myth is that if I care for you, then I'm entitled to exploit you or eat you. And we hear about how that myth applies to human abuses too. Like I did such and such for you, so you owe me such and such. And we know that that's wrong with humans. It's wrong with animals too. So, okay, so what do these places usually look like? Before we move on, just notice that statement about where are the brothers. This may come up, but this is just something always to think about when you're thinking about chickens and eggs. Where are the brothers? Okay, so this farm was advertised as free range, humanely raised, and a small family farm. This is the farm where Ruby and our girls were rescued from a couple of years, well, a little over 2 years ago. And so this is the farm. This is considered free range, and it's considered cage free. We see no cages. And the way it's considered free range is there's probably at least one little door somewhere where the chickens technically have access to the outside. But could you imagine, a chicken from over here trying to make it all the way over there, or all of these chickens to get any fresh air? So they can technically say it, but it really is meaningless for the chickens. And you just see how they're all filthy. So when we hear about free range and cage free, is this what we picture? The rescuers talked about the smell of urine and feces was overwhelming. You see just minimal light. Some of these sheds don't have any light. And this particular farm was on the ASPCA's Humane Certified list. All right, so let's look at the environmental impact of the chicken exploitation industry. So now we're looking at the environment. This is a huge amount of water is wasted through consumption by birds, so they drink a lot of water. And also through the cleaning process, it takes a lot of clean, fresh water to clean the blood and feces in slaughterhouses. And then all of that water then becomes wastewater, so wastewater from the slaughterhouses and from the farms. And it's that manure runoff that leads to algae blooms, that leads to ocean dead zones and fish kills. We've seen fish kills, especially after Hurricane Florence, with all of that manure runoff from the manure lagoons. And then opportunity food loss occurs with eggs as it does with chicken flesh. So more feed goes in than what is actually yielded. And it's even worse for dairy. So a 40% protein loss for eggs, 75% protein loss for dairy. Okay, I'm going to skip this slide in the interest of time, but maybe someone will have a question during the Q&A about backyard chickens. So, okay, let's see if we can now talk about aquatic animals and maybe fishes. I always feel funny saying fishes if I know that the listener isn't used to that, but technically if it's more than one species of fish, it's okay to say fishes. If it's one species, it's fish, if it's plural. So that's my speech pathologist part of me talking right now. Okay. With fishes, again, there's a huge amount of food loss. Look at that, 4 kilograms of food going into fish feed to become 1 kilogram of fish meal. Then that fish meal is turned around and 45% of it is fed to chickens, turkeys, and pigs. And it's all unnecessary because we don't need to consume any animals. The eco certifications are often given by organizations that have a vested interest in continuing the fishing industry. And then farmed fishes has the same problems as factory farming with land animals, the problems with disease from overcrowding and antibiotic use to prevent infection. Okay, I'm going to skip this one too in the interest of time. Let's talk about regenerative agriculture. This is the other myth. It's also known as rotational grazing. There are a few other terms for it. So it's important to know that there are these bold claims that we've heard from proponents of regenerative agriculture. They've been widely debunked. They've been debunked by numerous peer-reviewed studies. So the supporters will say that methodically moving cows around a plot of land, and that's basically how it works, around a plot of land is the solution to improving soil health and sequestering carbon. But the truth is that there's a limit to how much an area can sequester. So it's not like it's limitless, like the proponents will say. And then another problem is the amount of methane and nitrous oxide from the cows. Those are very potent greenhouse gases. And so that outweighs whatever carbon is sequestered. We have the same problems with biodiversity loss, and we just don't have enough land. For the 7 billion people we have on this planet, there just is not enough land to raise all animals this way. We'd need 5 planet Earths. And now we're aiming for Mars right now, but it's not happening. So, and on an interesting note that we really don't hear about, rewilding yields the most sequestration. And rewilding would occur the most with plant-based agriculture because you have more space that's freed up when you're not using so much land to grow, feed, and to raise the animals. So that's really the solution, is a plant-based agriculture system that allows for rewilding. And rewilding would be not only with the plant species, like native plant species, but also with some of the native animals. In regenerative agriculture, what sometimes happens is that native animals like elk are displaced, and then the agriculture proponents bring in cows. But you can have regeneration without substituting the native species with a species that really does not belong there. And I want to share some of what I learned from Andrea Davis. Andrea worked for small family goat dairies in North Carolina and Hawaii. And she tells me that she specifically looked for farms that were small and had a humane designation. But she saw horrific abuses at every farm. And she said every farm. And she could no longer tolerate seeing babies and older goats being sent to slaughter. So she moved out to Colorado and started what was going to be the first slaughter-free dairy. And then in 2017, she changed that very successful dairy to a farmed animal sanctuary. And this quote from her explains that main issue that led her to convert that dairy to a farmed animal sanctuary. She said, "Let me say this again, because it seems to be the hardest for dairy defenders to accept." And that was me until 2012. No matter how small or humane you think a dairy is, all babies will be taken from their mothers, all of them, every farm, every time. And this will happen year after year until the mother is eventually sent to slaughter when her milk production dies. Okay, so what are the solutions? The most comprehensive analysis to date of the damage farming does to the planet found that going vegan is the single biggest way to reduce your impact on the planet. And so as individuals, what can we do? We can live vegan. We also need to consider the source. So if we are reading an article, look to see who, if there's a study, who funded the study? Was it funded by the cattle industry or the egg board? So just question the information, especially if it comes from an organization that will profit off of what they're telling you. We can advocate against subsidies and bailouts for animal agriculture, and that is a huge problem. We can adopt farmed animals and start a microsanctuary. As an institution, we should be promoting entirely plant-sourced food systems and foods. And I'm going to skip down to farmers. Interestingly, there have been so many farmers who were involved in animal agriculture who realized that the time to switch to plant agriculture is now. And so these 3 organizations have formed to help farmers make that switch. So any farmers who you know who would be interested in making the switch, these are great resources. And I've got lots of resources, websites, videos, books. So feel free to email me if you have questions or if you're inspired and want to go vegan. There are mentoring groups. So, okay, I hope this is you now. So this is Ruby. This is Ruby running for supper. So, okay, so hopefully that apprehension is ended. But I did say that I would tell you just a little bit more about Ruby, and then I'll pass it on to Gwen. Okay, so Ruby, she died of breast cancer at 23 months old in October. And I learned so much from her, loved her so much. Everybody really loved her who met her, even just in videos. She had so much personality. Each of our chickens have different personalities. And when you're not in a farming situation, you really get to know who they are. But she was my favorite. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sena. That was fantastic. As someone who's been a vegetarian for almost 2 decades, that was still a lot of new information for me, and I really appreciate it. Okay, we're gonna keep moving along. We did get some questions. I appreciate it, and even a couple privately, and we'll get to those at the end, but keep them coming in the chat, and we'll turn things over to Gwen.
Thank you so much, Sean. Sena, thank you for an amazing presentation. That was so important and powerful. And thank you, Dr. Kinafuchi, for bringing this series to life. I'm glad we're having these dialogues and making it work on Zoom. It's kind of working out. All right, so I had to change the title of my talk just a little bit from what was published, only in the interest of time, trying to kind of scale back some of the content. I realize these are short dialogues, and I've eliminated a lot of the theoretical foregrounding of the work that I do, which feels like a cardinal sin in academia, but I'll just refer you to my book. If you're interested in exploring ecofeminism more, I find that a lot of students are just jazzed by the topic and really want to explore more. So I invite you to open a dialogue with me anytime as well. So this presentation, Trans-Species Harms and the Multiplicity of Violences Resulting from the Domination of Non-Human Animals, it draws on some of the ideas developed in my book, but also some of the work that I'm doing right now on nonviolence and thinking really very holistically about violence and nonviolence, and really this idea that you can't kind of surgically reduce violence in one area of life and expect to have nonviolence in another area. So in this presentation, what I'm hoping to reveal to you is that there's a strong link between human and non-human animal oppressions. That basically, I hope to convince you that our fates are intertwined. So dismantling the oppression of one also necessitates the dismantling of the other. So this is obviously a very broad topic, and I'm just going to take one really narrow slice, and that is focusing on the violence towards non-human animals through the institutionalized terror in the factory farm industry, and subsequently how the trauma of animal execution in slaughterhouses may exacerbate existing social harms among slaughterhouse workers and may likely fuel direct interpersonal violence between humans. So I'm fundamentally concerned with questions like, how might one type of violence morph into another type of violence? And in what ways might violence against non-human animals bolster human-to-human violence? All right, so the factory farm industry, we all know, is an intrinsically violent enterprise. It's really challenging, overwhelming really, to envision just the magnitude of slaughter and death of animals because it's in the billions. Their rapid elimination is endlessly repeated with a massive operation of reproductive control, breeding of and replacement of animal bodies, on and on. In just the United States alone, there are 10 billion farm animals held captive and killed for eggs, milk, and meat each year. An estimated 50 million non-human animals are killed for human food globally. The sentience of non-human animals, the fact that they feel pain and desire to be free and reside in their natural habitat, is entirely subjugated for profit in the factory farming industry. Scholars have described factory farms as places of gratuitous cruelty. a climate of unending terror. Violence in this way is allowed, permitted, normative, tolerated, precisely because animals are othered. Their non-human status subjects animals to an exploitive profit apparatus where the dynamics of violence against animals are deeply institutionalized. So this animal agriculture apparatus also depends on the exploitation of female reproductive systems. Now, this endangers the health of not just non-human animals, but also humans who consume these reproductive secretions. So just think about reproductive systems of animals being exploited and just sort of the implications that that might have in a world where gender dynamics matter in our context. Dairy cows are often hooked up to milking machines for up to 18 hours a day. Their baby calves are taken away within a short time after birth. The mothers are bred to produce an unnaturally large volume of milk, an overproduction which leaves cows vulnerable to a whole host of physical problems. Cows are kept in this constant artificial reproductive state. They are relentlessly force-fed. They are artificially inseminated. The bodies of female cows are aggressively wrung out for years. And once they are depleted, they're finally sent to slaughter. So this massive and extensive institutional suffering that humans inflict on animals is justified by this sharp distinction that we make of animals as inferior and humans as superior. So as these reproductive systems of female animals in this violent industry are used in service of profit, it shows the extent to which animals are oppressed by our own beliefs about exploitability, right? Which bodies are considered disposable, exploitable. And I'm arguing that the consequences of such systems of harm reach far beyond non-human animal species. So even for people who don't care about animals, and I know that there are a lot of humans who just don't care, I would argue that in fact, this animal oppression is profoundly entangled with our own human oppression. So let's think about our ideologies for a minute. And by that, I mean our belief systems. So the justifications that are necessary to pull off this level of institutionalized terror and violence really are rooted in beliefs about human-animal differences, where for a variety of reasons, we consider animals inferior. Namely, we think that they are less capable than humans, less intelligent than humans, or lacking in natural affinities. And I'd like to point out that these conceptual distinctions of inferior, superior are uncomfortably similar to justifications for racial, sexual, and gender hierarchies in our own human social milieu. So let's switch gears just a little bit to talk about humans who work in slaughterhouses. So thinking about the social order of the meat industry, we note that animal executioners, the people that actually have to commit this violence, that they're some of the most marginal human beings in the United States. Now, factory farming is certainly brutalizing for animals, but also for the human workers. This industrial animal for food apparatus has a very narrow profit margin, relies on really vulnerable employees, often undocumented workers, who are some of the most silent and disempowered in the workforce. They're mostly male immigrants who are very much at risk of death and injury. And I'm sure that you all know the very often cited statistic that slaughterhouse work is among the most dangerous jobs in the world. this practice of killing, particularly in a kind of neoliberal framework where the process has to be efficient, which means really fast, really mechanized, it means that the work of cutting up carcasses, it sounds horrifying work, right? But if you think about what actually takes place, there's quite a lot of injuries that happen along the way. So, people who have to practice killing, cutting up carcasses, they must suppress their own empathy. And more than likely, they're traumatized by the pain that they're obligated to inflict on animals. So there's this spiritual, psychological devastation that factory farm workers face, but also a huge number of health hazards, high number of accidents, being wounded by knives as they are carving up carcasses, or injured by animals who are fighting back against inflicted cruelty. So you all also probably know common knowledge, and I'm glad a lot of this has come out in the mainstream since COVID, when we've been talking more about what's going on inside of slaughterhouses, but they're usually in very isolated rural areas. These marginal workers are unlikely to submit complaints, to organize. They have very few alternative employment options. And in addition to their psychological distress, their low pay, and their high safety risks, migrant slaughterhouse workers are less likely to report injuries because, frankly, they're afraid of losing their jobs. They may face language barriers, deportation, and of course, lack of health care. Now, so there's mounting evidence, and continuing with this theme that our fates are intertwined, that violence in one area is going to spill over into violence in another area, and that nonviolence is only achievable by taking a holistic approach. There's mounting evidence that cruelty to animals is very much bound up with violent behavior towards other humans. So you just think about, considering domestic violence in particular, there's quite a lot of literature that looks at how animal cruelty, especially towards domestic pets, is not uncommon at all in domestic violence cases. And while this area of research is still emergent, there isn't a whole lot of work on it yet. There are a few studies that I just want to quickly mention. That a really fascinating study by Fitzgerald and colleagues in 2009 discovered there is in fact a correlation between slaughterhouses and increased crime rates. So these scholars attribute these findings to what they call the Sinclair Effect, which references Upton Sinclair's observations in his book, The Jungle, that brutality that's required, that's expected from slaughterhouse workers will translate to after-work fights in the case of Sinclair's work. So it follows then that the job of killing animals in a slaughterhouse may result in emotional desensitization, in distortion of our kind of ordinary sensibilities, along with a real negative psychological and social health effects, and also possibly violent behavior. Another 2015 study, be happy to provide references to all of these if anybody's interested in following up, also discovered an association between the location of slaughterhouses and increased crime rates in the community. If it's true that slaughterhouse workers are, engaging in violence as a kind of vocation while they're at work, it warrants investigation of how such violence might kind of impact their human-to-human relationships outside of work. Another study in 2002 discovered that slaughterhouse workers, because it's their job to kill animals, that they had a diminished capacity to express empathy to fellow humans. Now, just a little caveat that the causes of violence are obviously very, very complex. And, I study violence and I hesitate to even just give this little cursory literature review. And, this link between animal cruelty and human violence, as I mentioned, has not received quite enough attention from scholars. Yet, it does seem logical that most of us could probably agree that the two, violence against animals, violence against humans, may share some common denominators. And moreover, the practice of a kind of trans-species kinship really does logically extend to recognizing the inherent dignity of all living beings, which is something that must stand as a precursor to a nonviolent world. Okay, so this profound suffering that humans inflict on non-human animals is justified by our numerous hierarchical frameworks that regard the natural world as having lesser value, and a kind of ideology that non-human animals are kind of lacking in inherent worth. So identifying the connections between violence inflicted on non-human animals and human interpersonal violence really exposes for us these roots as being very much embedded in a larger hierarchical social system where animals are sort of at the bottom, right? They're determined to have less import and value. So these violent practices that I've just described here are at their core, they require that the oppression of non-human animals must be supported by our own beliefs, by our own ideology about the exploitability of other bodies for human consumption. So the consequences of such system of harm, they reach far beyond the animal or the non-human. Violence between humans is also rooted very much in beliefs about difference. These modes of differencing echoes justifications for exclusion and discrimination based on all sorts of other hierarchies that we experience in our social life every day. So in conclusion, I'd like to ultimately suggest that the solutions to violence can't be engineered in sort of a piecemeal fashion, right? Oh, I'm going to be nonviolent in my interpersonal life, but I'm okay to engage with this violent enterprise called factory farming. I'm saying that we can't like accommodate this existing social apparatus by kind of surgically removing violence in one area, but not in another area. We live in an anti-ecological society, and it is characterized by these dualities of otherness that absolutely pervade our separation from nature. And these dualities are characterized by opposition, by antagonism, by domination, and they're held together by these very systemic beliefs that influence patterns of violence, and they're informed by a larger ideology that really regards control and destruction of the biosphere as just normative, right? Just everyday kind of business. So one approach, I don't have all the answers, but I have some ideas that we could actually start today. One approach to nonviolence is to reverse our antipathy that we hold towards the natural world, to begin to work to dismantle this anti-ecological stance, which is very much a part of our alienation from nature. Thomas Berry reminds us that the universe is not a collection of objects, but a collection of subjects, right? That every living thing has a subjectivity, right? To hold that, to not forget that. To work on cultivating reverence, rapport, and respect for other modes of being, even other modes of being that we don't fully understand, both human and non-human. This is necessary for a nonviolent ecological society. Moreover, to the extent that we regard human problems as separate from the more than human life world, we're just continuing to perpetuate these dualistic paradigms which continue to feed ideologies of superior and inferior. And it's these hierarchical ideologies that inform our behavior in such adverse and devastating ways. Since the domination of humans by other humans is bound up with the domination of nature, our interventions must challenge the roots of this very system. So I would add, just in closing, my last point, that this movement towards violence prevention or a nonviolent world must include a prohibition against animal cruelty and violence towards both humans and animals as a necessary universal moral imperative. And this work begins with challenging human exceptionalism. It also means reinventing ourselves at the species level. This is the age of moral urgency that also begs for a recognition of our kinship with all life on Earth. To acknowledge our embeddedness in nature reminds us that we're not separate from other forms of life. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gwen. So many feelings. I wish Zoom had more emojis for crying and stuff like that. Yeah, really powerful stuff. So we have been getting a lot of questions and chatter in the chat room, and I'm going to go ahead and allow everybody to unmute themselves now if you want. And I don't know if we're going to have time to get to every question, but we'll do our best. And I always send a follow-up email afterwards. And so I always invite our speakers to provide additional resources that could be useful for people that we can include in that email to y'all as well. So I did get a private question. It was for Sena. Do you have any data on the sustainability of insects as a food source? So I know honey comes up frequently in that kind of discussion, and is honey a vegan food or not?
Thanks for asking. And I almost said honey, like I kept saying flesh and eggs and secretions, and honey is not vegan. And so I don't have any data about, I know that some people will eat crickets and that there are different insects people will eat. And that is one of the topics that I will hear about. But from a vegan perspective, and this may be the distinction between vegan or someone who's on a plant-based diet. So vegan is this overall ethic that you don't exploit someone, and insects are someone's, so we wouldn't eat them. And so even like with honey, we don't eat bees, but you're still taking the food. So they make honey as their food, and it takes them a long time to even produce just like a teaspoon of honey, and that's to feed their colony. So if we take that honey, that's taking their food. And you know, some bees are often harmed in the process, but it's really about that basic idea that you don't take the product of someone else's labor.
Thank you. And we had a lot of questions and comments about backyard chickens. And I know you have some, and I know you addressed some of those, but maybe for people who couldn't catch up with all that in the chat, you can talk about those specifically.
Okay, yeah, and I didn't describe how we have our chickens. So we have 4 chickens, and because we're in the city of Greensboro, and we have a secure run that we built that's predator proof, and 2 chicken coops because 2 of the chickens don't get along great with one of the chickens. But we do let the chickens out of the run so that they can forage in the grass and under some of our foliage. But they're always supervised because we worry about hawks. So, in that picture of the bucolic setting, I didn't see any like overhead protection. But then, my sentence in that one slide also was, where are the roosters? I think that may be one of the biggest issues with the concept of backyard chickens, that every hatchery in the United States, really every hatchery worldwide, although I know there are some in Germany that are experimenting with different ways. But every hatchery, when chickens lay eggs, like most other animals, it's usually 50-50 males, females. So at the hatcheries, when the chickens lay eggs, you've got 50 males, 50% males, 50% females, and the hatcheries then have to sex the eggs. And the ones that are, once they hatch, the ones that are male, there's no economic benefit to them. And maybe I'm cynical enough to know that everything is really based on economics and money, but they don't lay eggs, so the roosters are of no benefit because of that. They don't produce really enough flesh to make them something that you would sell to eat. So they are destroyed at the hatcheries right after being hatched, and they're either macerated, which is grinding them alive, or they're suffocated either by being buried or thrown in trash bags. And so the thought of that, like none of us would put a baby bird in a blender, and we see baby birds and we think of, gentle, and we think of spring. And so just that idea that every time you see a hen, so in that picture, all those hens, every time you see a hen, there was a boy who was killed. And that is 100% part of the process. Every hatchery does that. And so I just don't want to be a part of that system. I don't want to consume an egg that came from that system. But then other things like Carrie was asking some great questions in the chat, and I'm sorry I wasn't able to get to all of them. But with backyard chickens, the chickens expel so much energy and so much of their own nutrients that they need to produce the eggs. And way back, chickens were jungle fowl. They would lay eggs like 1 a month, so about 12 a year. And like women, human women, we would ovulate once a month. So they've been bred over the years so that they lay almost an egg every day. When our chickens are laying, it's an egg every day, and we hear them scream when they're laying. And so it takes all those nutrients, imagine every day, all those nutrients to make this egg. And so at most sanctuaries, either they feed the egg back to the chicken to replenish those nutrients, or luckily we could afford to have our chickens implanted, and that stops the laying process. But reproductive disease is like one of the #1 killers, like illness wise, of chickens. And it's because of this massive egg laying. And so again, I just don't want to be a part of that system. And I think my perspective has gotten stronger in that since we have chickens, and I've seen some of the torment that they go through, like it can be hours trying to get comfortable just finding the right place to lay. So I don't know if that's helpful, but really the rooster issue is probably the biggie.
Thanks, Sena. And then I'll pitch this one to Gwen. Let's see, we got a question from Laura Robinson. And why do you think there is so much hostility towards veganism and vegans? And do you think there are ways to diffuse that?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. My spouse thinks that it's our unacknowledged guilt. That's his response. But it's something that I think about a lot. And just as a vegan and being involved in the animal emancipation movement for years now, and have personally experienced a lot of direct hostility, it's something that I think about quite a lot. I mean, I think at a fundamental level, it gets at something deeply personal that involves desire, that involves addiction. I mean, I love sugar, right? Vegan pastries, and I feel pretty sad when I read articles about how terrible sugar is for me, right? I mean, it's tough to receive this news that gets at our fundamental desires and addictions, and it is deeply personal because it's what we put in our body, which is why I think that the process of both animal emancipation work and the process of trying to give up to personally stop consuming animal products needs to be met with a lot of compassion. It's hard. I didn't go vegan overnight. It took years, and I kind of did it in stages, and I needed a lot of support and a lot of resources and recipes, and I had to learn how to cook again, and needed a community. So, I think that diffusing that hostility, both on the part of people who are trying to transition their diets and animal emancipation work, is an important part of transformation.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll just add really quickly to that. I've been reading about nonviolence and Gandhi's philosophies, and he really talks a lot about making sure that you understand what the truth is, and that you also continue to respect people's humanity when talking to them about the truth, and that it's really our lack of understanding that's the issue, and not their humanity that is the issue, right? That we have to respect people as humans. And Gwen, I thought, how do we translate that to animals? And I really liked how you phrased it as their own subjectivity and their own kind of understanding their own experience of the world, and that they have their own perceptions and views and interactions with the world. And frequently we see more care for animals in which we project our humanity onto them. So if they look cute, or if they have more, if they smile, or if they have expressive faces. But I think we do need to do a better job of respecting their own personhood or animalhood as well. I know that was a big thing for me becoming vegetarian. We don't have a lot of time. There have been a lot of comments and questions, and we can save those and address those, have our speakers address those in the follow-up email if they have time for that. I did want to, there was one question, and the chat's going by so fast. This is awesome. So I can't remember who asked it, but somebody did ask, and I can let both of you answer this, about what you see the future of farming being. Gwen, maybe you want to start, and then we can let Sena talk.
Oh, 3 words. The future is vegan.
Great, thanks. Sena?
I saw that question. Was that from Nathan?
I'm
Anyway,
not sure. I've lost the chat. It's just been scrolling by, and I've lost track of it.
I think he asked about like hydroponic farming, and it was a really good question. And I am so interested in vertical farming and hydroponics, but also I didn't really get to touch on veganic farming. And so that's a new term for some people. Veganic is basically organic farming, but it's without the intentional animal input. And, people think that, well, you can't grow crops without manure, but you can. So it is, like I said, it's like organic farming, but it fits the vegan ethic because no one is exploited. And then follows like appropriate like land management practices, I think like no-till and things like that. But the amendments are just non-animal amendments.
Thanks. And Jacob, it was Jacob, if he's still,
oh, sorry.
If he wanted
sorry, I
to
called him Nathan.
add anything.
Sorry, Jacob.
No? Okay. All right.
Sorry.
Oh, go ahead, Jacob.
I was going to say, no, you basically touched on it. I mean, I tend to be a contrarian, so I have a lot of questions about this, but I'm mostly pescatarian, but I'm very forward about land use practices. I intend to go work for the Forest Service, where we see a lot of problems with land use issues with nutrient runoff. And I would just ask you, what is the future of farming seen as from a vegan's eyes, as far as aquaponics using fish and just regular hydroponics using organic animal byproduct fertilizers? And she did touch on that, so great.
Thanks so much.
But my answer would also be like, if it's hydroponics, not using fish. But I'm not an expert on hydroponics. But thank you, Jacob.
Okay. We really appreciate everybody's appearance today and joining us, and many thanks to our guest speakers. Etsko, do you want to take us out real quick? Any additional comments?
No, I think the questions are addressed really well, but I just wanted to, one of the questions that was raised about violence in veganism, why people are hostile to vegans, and I think part of that is the hegemony of meat eating that we have been we have been told that that's the way it should be. So, and then food is, I think people think of it as our right. Eating is, whatever, food is our right. And that's one of the few things we can control in our lives. And so that being attacked, if you are feeling attacked about food you eat, I think that veganism is, of course, much more than that. But I think that's part of, I'm finding that that's part of the picture, that I don't want you to tell me what I eat, So that's kind of part of this culture that we live in. And I think ecofeminism also has a lot to say about the separation of our realities. So read Gwen's book, and Sena has a lot of great resources. So I suggest everyone to seek out those two speakers. And if you have more questions, or if you're interested in becoming vegan,
I think let's go ahead and Carrie sent in a follow-up question. So, and Carrie, if you want to unmute, I know you've been really active in the chat. We frequently get questions about, what to do with the animals that are there now, right? If I'm understanding your question, Carrie, and how do people who are in the farming system make a living if they're not farming animals? Did I surmise that well enough, Carrie?
Pretty much. I mean, I think some of the concerns that I hear from people who eat meat are like, what do you expect to just let all the animals free? Just let them roam free, let them cause destruction, whatnot. I know I took a class on wild hogs for my environmental education certification, and they talked about, all of these European hogs that got brought over that aren't native. And if we let out, released domestic pigs, they can mate with those, and they cause a lot of destruction to our native ecosystems, especially in the mountains. So they also cause damage to people's fences and property and things like that. So I wasn't sure, how do you fight these arguments? How do you have a healthy debate with that, I guess?
That's such a good question, Carrie. And we do hear that, like maybe more to the extreme, like, but the world will be overpopulated and we'll be overrun by cows everywhere, but usually the question is prefaced with, but we can't go vegan overnight because that would happen, right? But I'm not really that familiar with the issue of wild hogs. I always answer with that with farmed animals, they're purposely bred into the system. And it's not like we're all going to go vegan overnight. It is a process. So as demand is lessened for animal products, then fewer animals will be bred into the system. I'd like to say that is happening, but part of the problem is with subsidies and bailouts for animal agriculture. I don't think that's really happening now. So it's important for me to support that. I don't know if you saw in that one page about the Agriculture Fairness Alliance, because they have lobbyists fighting against those bailouts and subsidies. But with chickens, that one shed where our girls came from, there were 14,000 chickens in that shed. And the rescuers were told, because the farm was about to get shut down, the rescuers were told they could take as many as they could who they had found homes for. So they were able to rescue 436. And so the remaining, 13-something thousand ended up getting slaughtered. And so that probably will happen if there aren't enough, if it was like overnight, would happen if there weren't enough sanctuaries and microsanctuaries. So that's one reason too why this microsanctuary movement is growing, because if several people takes in just a few farmed animals, that really can make an impact. And boy, roosters, I talked about with the backyard chickens, every sanctuary I know gets calls from people with roosters, you know, they bought chickens, they bought baby chicks, and the baby chicks come in the mail, and there may be one that turned out to be a rooster because it was missexed. He was missexed at the hatchery, and maybe they're in Greensboro and we can't have roosters, so then they have to find a home. So either the rooster is abandoned or killed, or they try to find a sanctuary, but they're all so often full because they get calls every day about roosters. So I kind of went off on a tangent, but
no, you also answered some other questions I had, is like sanctuaries can only hold so much. And then how do we regulate those sanctuaries? Because some people have the best of intentions and then they become hoarders, and then the animals aren't really left off very well either.
You're exactly right. And it's complex. So I think we should have some inspections, like there are shelter inspections and stuff. So there should be some system in place to ensure safety and quality, because you're right, best intentions don't always work.
Thank you so much for offering your input on that. I enjoyed that. Thank you.
Thanks, Carrie.
I hope everybody has a great day, a great weekend, enjoy the sunshine, and be on the lookout for more events in the future. Thank you again, everybody. Take care.